The air in the valley didn't just turn cold, it turned lethal. But long before the first flake of snow touched the frozen dirt of Montana, the whispers had already spread to the town of Oakhaven. They pointed at the ridge, where a silver arc of corrugated steel broke the horizon like the spine of some prehistoric beast. That was the home of William Wynne, a man who had traded his medals for solitude and his dress uniform for heavy canvas work clothes. At 50 years old, William carried the weight of a dozen shadows in his moss-green eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and now preferred the silent, steady company of Smoky, his 30-kilogram German shepherd. The townspeople called it the madman's bunker. They watched from their heated SUVs as William spent months hauling reinforced steel beams and digging deep into the frost-hardened earth. Why build a Quonset hut in the 21st century? They asked over coffee at the local diner. To them, it was an eyesore, a relic of a bygone military era that had no place in their picturesque mountain community. They saw a man who was paranoid, a man lost in the echoes of a war they didn't want to remember. But William didn't build for aesthetics. He built for the one thing soldiers never forget, the inevitability of a storm. Smoky, a K-9 operative with a coat like midnight and burnt amber, was the only one who understood. He watched the barometer with the same intensity as his master. As the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, the wind began to groan. A low-frequency vibration that rattled the windows of the wooden mansions down in the valley. William tightened the final bolt on the intake vent of his independent air filtration system. He wasn't just building a house. He was preparing a lifeboat. And as the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single hour, the laughter in the valley began to die out, replaced by the chilling realization that the veteran they mocked was the only one truly ready for what was coming. The crazy cabin was about to be tested by a force that didn't care about neighborhood property values. It only cared about who was strong enough to stay warm. When the power grid failed, it didn't go out with a bang. It went out with shiver. One by one, the lights of Oakhaven flickered and died, leaving the town in a suffocating, frozen darkness. This wasn't just a storm. It was an atmospheric collapse. The White Death had arrived. Outside the Quonset cabin, the wind hit 90 miles per hour, screaming like a jet engine as it tore the shingles off the million-dollar homes down the road. Inside, however, the silence was heavy and thick. The curved steel walls of William Wynne's home, reinforced with earth and gravel, didn't even vibrate. William sat by his wood-burning stove, the smell of seasoned oak and gun oil filling the air. He wasn't panicking because he had lived this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He checked the thermal sensors he'd buried in the perimeter. The temperature outside had hit a record-shattering minus 50 degrees. A person's lungs would freeze in minutes out there. He looked at Smoky. The dog wasn't resting. He was pacing the length of the arched floor, his nose twitching toward the door. Smoky's K-9 instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Not just the weather, but something closer. Suddenly, a faint, rhythmic thumping echoed against a heavy steel door. It was barely audible over the roar of the blizzard, but to a trained ear, it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. Someone who had ignored the warnings. Someone who had laughed at the madman and was now dying on his doorstep. William stood up, his tall, muscular frame casting a long shadow against the corrugated walls. He knew that opening that door meant risking the precious heat of his sanctuary. It meant letting the storm inside. He gripped the heavy iron handle, his moss-green eyes hardening. Smoky stood at his side, a low growl vibrating in his chest, not out of aggression, but out of a shared sense of high-stakes survival. The door groaned as William heaved it open, fighting against the wall of wind that tried to blast its way inside. A cloud of ice crystals swirled into the warm air of the cabin, creating a ghostly fog. There, collapsed against a frame, was a man William recognized. It was Miller, the local real estate developer who had been the loudest critic of the eyesore on the hill. Miller was barely conscious, his face a terrifying shade of blue, his eyelashes heavy with ice. He had tried to reach his high-tech, glass-wall mansion, but the structure had failed him. The roof had buckled under the weight of the snow, and the floor-to-ceiling windows had shattered under the wind's pressure. "Get him in, now!" William barked, though there was no one but Smoky to hear him. Smoky didn't hesitate. The dog gripped Miller's frozen sleeve with his powerful jaws and helped William drag the dying man across the threshold. William slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The silence returned, but the stakes had changed. His sanctuary was no longer just for him and his dog. As William stripped away Miller's frozen layers, he saw the extent of the storm's cruelty. Miller's hands were white, stage 3 frostbite. In his pocket, a radio crackled with static, a desperate voice from the valley floor, screaming for help. The town was failing. The modern houses, built for beauty rather than survival, were turning into icebox tombs. William looked at his Quonset walls. They were ugly, they were industrial, and they were the only reason Miller was still breathing. He looked at Smoky, whose moss-green eyes seemed to understand the grim mission ahead. They couldn't just stay inside and wait it out. There were more people out there, and William Wynne, the man they called crazy, was the only one with the gear, the dog, and the fortress to save them. The storm wasn't just weather anymore. It was a physical weight, a crushing hand of ice trying to flatten everything in its path. William Wynne stepped out of the Quonset's airlock, and for a moment, the world simply vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a screaming void of white. He was tethered to the cabin door by a high-tensile nylon rope, a lifeline in a world where direction had lost all meaning. Beside him, Smoky was a shadow in the drift. The dog's powerful muscles bunched and released as he plowed through snow that reached his chest. William had outfitted Smoky with a tactical LED harness, a pulsing red beacon that was the only thing visible in the blizzard. Every breath felt like swallowing needles. William's moss-green eyes were shielded by ballistic goggles, but even then, the frost crept across his vision. He wasn't just wandering. He was following the faint, intermittent signal from the radio he'd taken from Miller. A group of survivors was trapped in a collapsed barn 300 yards down the ridge. In these conditions, 300 yards might as well have been 300 miles. The wind shrieked at 100 miles per hour, threatening to tear William's broad shoulders right off the rope's axis. Smoky stopped suddenly, his black and tan ears twitching despite the roar. He let out a sharp, muffled bark and lunged toward a massive drift to the left. He wasn't following a signal. He was following a scent, the faint, metallic smell of human fear and freezing blood. William trusted the K9 more than any GPS. He unhooked his lifeline, a move that would be suicide for anyone else, and followed the red pulse of Smoky's harness into the heart of the white hell. They were no longer just a veteran and his dog. They were a search and rescue unit forged in the fires of past wars, now fighting a new kind of enemy. Underneath 5 feet of packed powder lay the ruins of the old Henderson barn. It hadn't stood a chance. The heavy timber beams had snapped like toothpicks, creating a jagged, frozen tomb for the 5 people huddled inside. Among them were the town sheriff and a young mother holding her shivering toddler. When William's tactical light cut through the darkness of the pocket, he didn't see the crazy hermit they had once joked about. They saw a giant in a canvas coat, a specter of survival who had come to drag them back from the edge of the grave. No time for talk. William's voice was a gravelly rasp, barely audible over the groaning wood. Follow the dog. He knows the scent of the cabin. Stay close or you die. He didn't offer comfort. He offered command. He handed his thermal cloak to the mother and hoisted an injured man over his broad shoulders as if he weighed nothing. Smoky led the way, his black and tan coat now a mess of ice and grit, but his pace never faltered. He was a K9 operative in his element, calculating the safest path through the shifting drifts. The journey back was a nightmare of endurance. The cold had moved past shivering. It was now a dull, Seductive ache that whispered for them to sit down and sleep. William felt the weight of the man on his back and the lives following his heels. His deep moss-green eyes burned with a singular focus. He counted his steps, synchronizing his breath with Smoky's rhythm. Every time the group faltered, Smoky would circle back, a low, fierce growl snapping them back to consciousness. They were a chain of souls, linked by a veteran's will and a dog's loyalty, moving toward the only spark of heat left in the world, the Quonset cabin. The interior of the Quonset cabin was no longer a lonely bunker. It had become a cathedral of survival. The roar of the blizzard was reduced to a distant, frustrated hum against the thick steel skin of the arch. Inside, the air was 70 degrees, thick with the smell of boiling soup and drying wool. William moved among the survivors with the efficient grace of a combat medic. He didn't ask for thanks, and he didn't offer small talk. He simply worked, tending to frostbitten fingers, handing out dry clothes from his military surplus bins, and maintaining the life support systems of the hut. The people who had once called this place an eyesore now looked at the curved walls with reverence. They saw the reinforced ribs of the structure, the way the earth shelter design held the heat, and the sophisticated air scrubbers that kept the oxygen fresh even with a dozen people inside. Miller, the developer, sat in the corner, staring at his hands. He looked at William, then at the steel ceiling. "I spent $4 million on my house," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "And it's gone. It's just glass and splinters. How did you know?" William didn't look up from the stove. "I didn't know," he replied. "I just remembered that the world doesn't owe us safety." Smoky lay in the center of the room, his black and tan coat finally dry. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the door. He was the sentinel of the sanctuary. Despite the warmth and the food, William Wynne knew they weren't out of the woods. The barometer was still dropping. The storm was entering its second, more violent phase. And as the radio began to pick up more distress calls, some from miles away, William realized his Quonset cabin wasn't just a lifeboat anymore. It was becoming a command center for a town that was being erased from the map. The storm didn't just return, it mutated. Meteorologists would later call it a bomb cyclone, but to the people inside the Quonset cabin, it felt like the earth itself was trying to shake them off its surface. The temperature outside plummeted to a lethal minus 75 degrees. Steel, usually so cold and unyielding, began to groan under the sheer atmospheric pressure. William Wynne stood by the main support arch, his hand pressed against the vibrating metal. He could feel the mountains screaming. Inside, the cabin was over capacity. 17 people, including 2 more families William had pulled from their buried cars, were now crammed into the arch sanctuary. The air scrubbers were working at triple speed, a low mechanical hum that competed with the whistling wind. William's moss-green eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, the deep crow's feet around them etched with the fatigue of a commander holding a line that shouldn't be holdable. He was rationing the oxygen, rationing the heat, and most importantly, rationing hope. Then, a sound that made even Smoky's fur stand on end, a sharp metallic crack. One of the exterior ventilation cowls, designed to withstand hurricane winds, had been sheared off by a flying piece of frozen debris. Suddenly, the internal pressure dropped. The precious warmth was being sucked out, replaced by a vacuum of lethal cold. If William didn't climb onto the roof, into the teeth of a 75 below zero gale, to seal that vent, every soul in the cabin would be frozen solid within 20 minutes. He looked at Smoky. There was no need for a command. The dog was already at the airlock, his fierce posture signaling he was ready to face the abyss one more time. On the roof of the Quonset hut, the wind didn't just howl, it had a physical presence, like a giant's hand trying to peel William off the steel. Gravity was suggestion, the wind was the law. William was flat on his stomach, his fingers protected by 3 layers of tactical gloves, fumbling with the emergency seal. He couldn't see. His goggles had iced over in seconds. He was working by touch, by the memory of the machine he had built with his own 2 hands. "Stay, Smoky! Stay!" he roared, but the wind swallowed the words. Smoky was his anchor. The dog had wedged himself into a crevice between the steel arch and the earth berm, his weight acting as a counterbalance for the safety line wrapped around William's waist. Every time a gust threatened to launch William into the void, he felt the sharp, reassuring tug of the K9, holding the line. It was a dance of survival performed in a zero-visibility nightmare. The metal was so cold it threatened to bond to his gear. William triggered the emergency sealant. The chemical hissed lost in the roar. He felt the vibration change. The vacuum was sealed. But as he turned to crawl back to hatch, a rogue gust, a hammer of air, slammed into him. The safety line snapped. For a terrifying second, William was sliding, his boots finding no purchase on the ice-coated steel. He was heading for the edge, for a 50-foot drop into a snowdrift that would become his grave. Then, a flash of black and tan. Smoky didn't bark, he acted. The dog launched himself from his anchor point, his jaws locking onto William's heavy canvas sleeve, with the strength of a predator and the heart of a brother. The silence that greeted William as he tumbled onto the floor of the cabin was profound. The 17 survivors watched in stunned awe as the man they had once mocked as a paranoid recluse dragged himself to his feet. He looked like a statue carved from ice. His salt and pepper beard was a solid mask of white. His moss-green eyes were rimmed with frost. Beside him, Smoky stood, his black and tan coat steaming as a 70-degree air hit his frozen body. The dog's tail gave a single, weary wag before he collapsed onto his tactical blanket. Without a word, the survivors moved. The young mother brought William a bowl of steaming broth. Miller, the once arrogant developer, handed him a dry wool blanket, his eyes full of a new kind of respect, the kind only earned in the shadow of death. There were no more jokes about the madman's bunker. In the eyes of everyone in that room, the Quonset hut was no longer a crazy experiment. It was the center of a universe. William took a sip of the broth, the heat blooming in his chest. He looked around his home. The curved walls felt smaller now, filled with the breath and heartbeat of his neighbors. He realized that for years he had been preparing for the storm to keep the world out. But the storm had done something he never expected. It had brought the world in. As the radio finally began to pick up the faint, distant signal of a National Guard rescue convoy, still days away, William knew they had passed a breaking point. They were no longer just survivors. They were a community, forged in steel and ice, led by a veteran and a dog who refused to let the cold win. The initial euphoria of survival slowly evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard mathematics of endurance. 17 mouths, 1,000 square feet, and a blizzard that refused to break. William Wynne sat at his heavy steel desk, his moss-green eyes scanning a handwritten ledger of their supplies. He had prepared for himself and Smoky to last a year, but for a crowd this size, his infinite pantry was shrinking at an alarming rate. The smell of wood smoke and damp wool was now tinged with a sharp scent of anxiety. "We go to 2 meals a day," William announced, his voice cutting through the low chatter of the cabin like a blade. "Water is strictly for drinking and medical. No exceptions." He saw the flicker of protest in Miller's eyes, the developer who was used to get what he wanted, but it died under William's hard stare. This wasn't a neighborhood association meeting. It was a survival operation. William wasn't just their host. He was their logistics officer. Even Smoky felt the shift. The dog, usually fueled by high-protein working rations, now watched as William carefully measured out smaller portions. Smoky didn't whine. He sat by the grain bins, his black and tan coat reflecting the dim emergency lights, his fierce posture serving as a silent reminder of the discipline required to stay alive. The cabin, once a symbol of madness, was now a masterclass in military efficiency. But as the carbon dioxide scrubbers began to whine under the strain of 17 sets of lungs, William realized that their greatest enemy wasn't the snow outside. It was the chemistry inside. On the 4th day of the Great Burial, the radio, William's only link to the living world, began to scream. Not with voices, but with the jagged, rhythmic pulse of an emergency beacon. It wasn't the National Guard. It was closer. A distress signal from the town's emergency shelter at the old high school, 3 miles away. The roof had collapsed, and the backup generators were failing. Hundreds of people were in the dark, and they were freezing to death. "I have to go," William said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to resonate through the steel floor. Miller stood up, his face pale. "You're going to leave us? In this?" William looked at the people he had saved, the mother, the child, the broken developer. "I'm not leaving you. I'm making sure there's still a town left to return to when this ends. Smoky knows the way back. If I don't return by dawn, Miller, you follow the dog. He'll take you to the ridge cache." William began to pull on his external frame pack, a massive skeletal structure designed to carry hundreds of pounds of emergency batteries and medical supplies. He was 50 years old, but in that moment, as he tightened the straps across his broad shoulders, he looked like an ancient warrior preparing for a final crusade. He didn't take a gun. He took a flare gun, a shovel, and his dog. Smoky sensed a mission. He paced by the airlock, his muscles tense like a coiled spring, his eyes burning with a fierce, primal intelligence. They were heading back out into the heart of the White Death, not for themselves, but for a town that had once turned its back on them. The high school was a ruin. The gymnasium roof had given way under 10 feet of snow, and the survivors were huddled in the basement cafeteria, the walls weeping with frost. When William Wynne and Smoky finally reached the heavy double doors, they were nearly frozen solid. William used his tactical shovel to clear the ice cake handles, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open with a force that sent a cloud of snow into the freezing room. The scene inside was a nightmare. 300 people, wrapped in curtains and gym mats, their faces gaunt. The local sheriff, his hands purple with frostbite, looked up and saw a man who looked more like a myth than a neighbor. William didn't say a word. He unslung his massive pack and began pulling out the high-density emergency batteries he'd carried. Through 3 miles of hell. Within minutes, he had patched them into the school's emergency heating circuit. But as the first hum of warmth returned to the cafeteria, a new sound echoed from the hallway, a sharp, terrifying groan of shifting concrete. The school wasn't stable. The weight of the snow was still pressing down, and the main support columns in the hallway were buckling. Smoky began to bark, a frantic, aggressive sound he only used for imminent danger. He wasn't barking at the cold. He was barking at the ceiling. William realized they had saved him from the cold only to trap them in a tomb. He had minutes to find a way to shore up the structure, or the 3 miles he had trekked would end in a mass grave. The sound of a school collapsing is unlike anything else. It's the groan of an entire generation's. Safety splintering under the weight of 1,000 tons of ice. William Wynne stood beneath the central load-bearing beam of the cafeteria, his muscular arms locked, his broad shoulders acting as a human jack. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a pillar of flesh and bone. "Move them, now!" he roared at the dazed survivors. He could feel the micro-fractures in the concrete vibrating through his spine. A rhythmic ticking clock of impending disaster. Smoky was a blur of black and tan, his barks directing the terrified crowd toward the reinforced kitchen area, the only part of the basement that wasn't bowing under pressure. The dog's K9 training kicked into a primal gear, sensing the structural failure points seconds before they gave way. He nipped at the heels of the slow, nudged the children forward, and stood his ground as chunks of ceiling plaster rained down like gray snow. Every second William held that beam was a second bought with his own life. His moss-green eyes were fixed on the flickering emergency light. His teeth gritted so hard they threatened to shatter. He was 50 years old, and every old wound from every old war was screaming in protest. But as he saw the last of the 300 survivors scramble into the safe zone, a strange calm washed over him. He was exactly where he was meant to be. He looked at Smoky, who was waiting at the edge of the collapse zone. His fierce eyes locked on his master. The veteran knew that when he let go, the world would come crashing down. It was a gamble of milliseconds. The cafeteria was now a tomb of steel and tile, and the oxygen was a ticking clock. 300 souls were trapped in a space meant for half that number. The silence was heavier than the snow outside. William would move through the crowd, his heavy boots clacking on the linoleum. He wasn't just their savior, he was their warden. He organized the air intake through the industrial oven vents, clearing them of ice with a blowtorch from his pack. Everyone sit, stay low, minimize movement, William commanded. His voice, though rough and exhausted, had the weight of a mountain. He sat at the center of the kitchen floor, his back against a stainless steel fridge. Smoky curled at his feet. The veteran didn't sleep. He watched. He watched the shadows. He watched the breathing patterns of the elderly. And he watched the door. In the flickering light, people began to talk. Not about the storm, but about the madman on the hill. They apologized in whispers, or simply looked at him with an intensity that bordered on worship. William didn't acknowledge it. He didn't want their praise. He wanted their survival. He looked at Smoky, whose ears were still pricked toward the blocked exit. The dog knew what William knew. They were buried under 15 feet of debris and snow. The rescue convoy wouldn't find them by sight. They needed a signal. They needed something that could pierce through the white death to the sky above. The sound was faint, a low-frequency thrumming that only Smoky's ears could catch at first. It was the heavy diesel engines of a National Guard clearing crew, still miles away. Blind in the whiteout, they were moving past the school, thinking no one could have survived the collapse. William Wynne knew if they missed this window, the oxygen in the kitchen would run out before they could be found. "I need to get to the vent," William whispered. The vent led to the roof, but was narrow, jagged, and packed with ice. He couldn't fit, but Smoky could. William pulled a high-intensity red flare from his pack and taped it to Smoky's tactical harness. He looked into the dog's eyes, deep, loyal, and understanding. "Smoky, go. Find the sky. Show them we're here." With a command and a boost, the 30-kilogram German shepherd vanished into the darkness of the narrow ventilation shaft. For agonizing minutes, the kitchen was silent. William stood below the vent, his moss-green eyes staring upward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the scratching of claws on steel, the muffled barks of the dog fighting through the ice. Then, a distant pop followed by a crimson glow that bled down through the vent. Smoky had made it. The red light of the flare bathed the survivors in a bloody, hopeful hue. Above the buried school, a crimson star had risen in the middle of the blizzard, a signal from a madman's dog that the town was still alive. The sound of the first industrial snow blower hitting the cafeteria's exterior wall was more beautiful than any symphony William Wynne had ever heard. It was a rhythmic, mechanical grinding that signaled the end of the world's longest night. Inside the kitchen, the survivors stood in a silence so thick you could hear the frost cracking off the pipes. William stood at the center, his hand resting on Smoky's head. The dog's black and tan fur was still singed from the flare, but his stance was as unwavering as a mountain. "They're here," William whispered. The word traveled through the room like a spark. When the first breach in the rubble finally opened, a shaft of artificial white light, the high beams of a National Guard recovery vehicle, sliced through the dark. A soldier in a white tactical parka stepped through, his rifle slung, his eyes widening as he saw the 300 souls William had kept alive. He looked at William, then at the muscular German shepherd, and for a moment, the chain of command was silent. The soldier didn't salute a rank. He saluted a man who had done the impossible. But the rescue was only half the battle. As the survivors were led out into the sub-zero air, William refused the first stretcher. He stayed until the last child was lifted through the breach. His moss-green eyes followed every face, checking for signs of shock or lingering frostbite. He had been a ghost in this town for years, a man ignored and pitted. Now, as he stepped out into the blinding glare of the rescue floodlights, The townspeople lined the cleared path, wrapping themselves in emergency blankets. Watching the madman emerge from the ruins, he had turned into a fortress of hope. The town of Oakhaven was a graveyard of architecture, but a sanctuary of souls. As the rescue convoys began the slow crawl toward the regional hospital, William Wynne turned his back on the cameras and the praise. He had one more mission: the 17 people he had left in his Quonset cabin. The National Guard commander offered him a seat in a warm Humvee, but William only pointed toward the ridge. "My home is still out there, and so are my guests." The trek back was different. The wind had died down to a bitter moan, and the sky was finally beginning to bleed a pale, icy blue, the first hint of dawn in 5 days. William and Smoky moved with steady, rhythmic pace. They passed the remains of Miller's glass mansion, now nothing more than a jagged pile of shards and twisted steel. It was a stark reminder that in the face of nature's fury, beauty is a luxury, but preparation is a necessity. When they finally reached the ridge, the Quonset hut was nearly invisible, buried under a massive, smooth dune of snow. Only the very tip of the silver arch and the reinforced ventilation pipes poked through. William felt a surge of pride. His crazy design hadn't just survived, it had thrived. He began to dig, his muscular arms working the shovel with a desperate intensity. Smoky joined him, paws throwing snow like a machine. As the steel door finally came into view, William hammered on it 3 times. The soldier's signal. The door creaked open, and the warm, amber light of his sanctuary spilled out onto the snow, proving that the madman's bunker was the only thing the valley that hadn't broken. The days following the blizzard were a blur of helicopters, news crews, and the slow, painful process of unearthing a town. Oakhaven would never be the same. The loss of property was staggering, but thanks to the veteran they once shunned, the loss of life was nearly zero. William Wynne didn't give interviews. He didn't sign book deals. He stayed on his ridge, repairing the damage to his vents and restocking his shelves. But something had changed. The isolation he had built around himself had been breached. He found baskets of food on his doorstep, hand-drawn thank you cards from school children tucked into his steel door, and most surprisingly, a group of neighbors, led by Miller, who showed up one Saturday with tools and lumber. They didn't come to fix his eyesore. They came to help him expand it. They realized that William Wynne wasn't a madman. He was a visionary who understood that the world's safety is a fragile illusion. William sat on his porch, a new structure built from the very timber that had once failed the school. Smoky lay at his feet, his black and tan ears twitching at the sound of the wind. The veteran looked down at the town, now rebuilding with thicker beams and stronger roofs. He knew the storms would come again. It was the nature of the world. But he also knew that he wasn't alone on his ridge anymore. He had taught a town how to survive, and in return, they had taught him how to belong. His Quonset cabin was no longer a bunker. It was a beacon. As the snow continued to retreat, revealing the scarred landscape of Oakhaven, a new kind of storm began to brew, one of curiosity. It wasn't just that William Wynne had survived. It was how he had survived. Engineers from the state capital, sent to assess the damage to the town's infrastructure, found themselves drawn to the ridge. They stood before the Quonset cabin, notebooks in hand, marveling at the air filtration systems and the geothermal loops William had dug 40 feet into the granite. This wasn't a surplus kit from a backyard DIY magazine. This was high-level military-grade engineering, designed for a fallout zone, not just a winter storm. Miller, now William's most frequent visitor, sat on the steel porch one evening, watching the veteran clean his thermal sensors. The guys from the state say this place is over-engineered by 500%. Miller said, his voice hesitant. They're asking where a man learns to build a self-sustaining life support system in his backyard. William didn't look up. His moss-green eyes were focused on the delicate circuitry of a sensor. He had spent 20 years in the gray zones of the world, places that didn't exist on public maps, building outposts that had to survive everything from chemical gas to kinetic strikes. Smoky sat between them, his black and tan ears swiveling toward the road. A black SUV, unbranded and out of place in a mountain town, was winding its way up the ridge. William's posture changed instantly. The relaxed civilian demeanor vanished, replaced by the rigid, lethal stillness of a K-9 operative. He recognized the hum of that engine. The blizzard had saved the town. But the signal Smoky had sent into sky with that red flare had reached ears far beyond Montana. The past wasn't just knocking on the door of the Quonset cabin. It was coming to reclaim its most talented ghost. The man who stepped out of black SUV didn't look like a soldier, which was exactly why William Wynne knew he was dangerous. He wore a crisp charcoal suit that was entirely too warm for a Montana spring. He was Agent Vance, a man William had last seen in a desert outpost 10,000 miles away. The flare was a nice touch, Wynne, Vance said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. But it lit up every satellite from here to Langley. You were supposed to stay dead. William didn't move. Smoky, however, began a slow, calculated circle around the agent, his paws silent on the gravel. Vance looked at the dog with a flicker of genuine fear. He knew about Smoky. He knew the dog had been trained for high-value recovery, a polite term for dragging bodies out of Hell's Capes. I didn't choose the storm, Vance, William growled, his voice like grinding stones. And I didn't choose to let 300 civilians freeze so I could keep your secrets. Vance sighed, looking at the Quonset cabin. The agency wants the blueprints back. William, not the ones for this house. The ones you took from the Caspian project. The filtration tech. The shielding. They think you've turned this ridge into a prototype. William stepped forward, his tall, muscular frame looming over the agent. It's not a prototype. It's a home. And the only way you're getting inside is if you bring enough men to flatten this mountain. The standoff was absolute. A veteran who had found his soul, a dog who lived for his master, and a government that couldn't allow a legend to live in peace. A line of dusty Montana pickup trucks pulling up to the ridge, headlights cutting through the dusk, extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. The sheriff, 50s, rugged, brown uniform, stepping out his cruiser, looking at Agent Vance with a skeptical expression. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. Miller, the developer, standing next to the sheriff, holding a heavy wrench, looking protective of William. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. William Wynne, 50 years old, looking at the crowd of neighbors, his moss-green eyes showing a rare moment of surprise and gratitude. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. Agent Vance in his suit, looking small and out of place surrounded by rugged Montana locals. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. Smoky, 30 kilograms German Shepherd, walking toward the sheriff, tail wagging once, recognizing a friend. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. A wide cinematic shot of the ridge. 20 trucks forming a protective circle around the Quonset cabin. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. William Wynne, 50 years old, standing with his arms crossed over his broad chest, a small, knowing smile on his face. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. Agent Vance's black SUV driving away into the darkness, its taillights two small red dots. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. Close-up of the sheriff's weathered hand patting William's shoulder. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. The neighbors beginning to unload crates of supplies and tools from their trucks. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. William Wynne, 50 years old, and Smoky standing in the center of the group, no longer isolated. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. The amber light of the cabin spilling out as more people enter to help with the internal repairs. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. Close-up of Smoky's fierce eyes now looking calm and loyal as he watches the children play nearby. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. William Wynne, 50 years old, looking at the stars above Montana. His deep forehead wrinkles looking less like scars and more like history. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. A shot of a neighborhood watch sign being jokingly pinned to the Quonset steel door. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. William Wynne silhouette against the curved iron roof. A guardian who finally has a home to guard. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. The town of Oakhaven glowing in the valley below. Its lights a testament to survival. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. William Wynne, 50 years old. Patting Smoky's head, the bond between them stronger than any steel beam. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. A final cinematic shot of the part. The Quonset cabin, the trucks, and the people. A fortress built of ire and community. Extremely detailed, 8K, photorealistic, cinematic shot, raw photo quality. The ridge was no longer a place of isolation. It had become a classroom. In the months following the confrontation with Agent Vance, the Quonset cabin evolved. William Wynne, once the town's most feared recluse, now found himself surrounded by the youth of Oakhaven. Every Saturday, a dozen teenagers would hike up the trail, their eyes wide with a mix of intimidation and respect. They didn't come for sports or video games. They came to learn how to read the clouds, how to patch a high-pressure line, and how to stay calm when the world turned white. William stood at the center of his gravel yard, his muscular frame draped in a worn canvas vest, his moss-green eyes scanning the group with a drill sergeant's precision. "The storm doesn't care about your feelings," he'd growl, his voice like grinding stones. "It only cares about your gear and your grit." Beside him, Smoky was the ultimate teaching assistant. The dog would demonstrate how to track a scent through freezing mud, or how to brace a human body against a simulated gale. Smoky wasn't just a pet to these kids. He was a legend they were finally allowed to touch. Even Miller, the man who once valued glass over steel, had enrolled his own son in William's informal academy. He watched from the porch as William taught the boy how to spark a fire from a dead battery and a piece of steel wool. William wasn't just teaching them to survive a blizzard. He was teaching them that self-reliance is the highest form of freedom. The madman's bunker had become the town's most vital schoolhouse. But as William looked at the darkening horizon, a familiar prickle moved down his spine. The air felt heavy, the barometer was twitching, and the veteran knew that a teacher's greatest test is always the one he doesn't schedule. The second test didn't come in the form of snow, but in the form of fire. A freak lightning strike during a dry spring storm ignited the pine forest on the eastern slope, and within an hour, the Oakhaven fire was a monster of orange and black. The wind, ever the enemy of this valley, was driving flames directly toward the town center. The evacuation routes were choked with smoke, and the modern wooden homes were nothing but kindling. "Get the kids to the cabin. Now!" The sheriff's voice crackled over the emergency radio. William Wynne didn't hesitate. He knew the Quonset cabin, with its earth-shelter design and non-flammable steel shell, was the only fireproof structure for 50 miles. As the sky turned a hellish orange, William and Smoky became a two-man evacuation team. They didn't go down to the town. They stayed on the ridge, serving as a beacon for the families who were being cut off by the advancing fire line. The heat was blistering. melting the rubber on William's tactical boots as he helped people through the fire break. Smoky was a demon in the smoke, his K9 senses finding the gaps in the flame where human eyes were blind. He wore a wet cooling vest William had fashioned, his fierce barks cutting through the roar of the fire to lead the panicked survivors toward the silver arch. The Quonset hut, once built to keep out the cold, was now being tested by the absolute heat of an inferno. William stood at the door, his moss-green eyes reflecting the flames. A warrior at the gates of hell, refusing to let even one person be taken by the fire. The fire passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world of charcoal and silence. But the Quonset cabin stood. When the smoke finally cleared on the second morning, the silver steel was scorched and blackened, but it hadn't buckled. Not a single person inside had suffered more than a cough. William, when stepped out onto his porch, his face a mask of soot and fatigue. He looked down at the valley. Oakhaven was still there, but half the homes were smoldering foundations. He didn't wait for the fire crews to arrive. He began to organize the recovery. The madman was now the town's de facto commander. He used his cabin's independent water supply to help douse the remaining hot spots and turned his pantry into a community kitchen once again. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't ask for a title. He just did what he had always been trained to do, hold a line when everyone else was retreating. As the sun set over the blackened ridge, the people of the town gathered around the cabin. They weren't looking at a relic of the past anymore. They were looking at the future. They realized that William Wynne hadn't just built a house. He had built philosophy. He had proven that in a world of fragile glass and wood, there's a place for steel and bone. Miller, whose home was one of the few saved by William's firebreak, sat on the porch steps next to Smoky. "You're not the madman, Will," Miller said quietly. "We were the crazy ones for thinking the world was safe." William looked at Smoky, then at the rebuilding town, his moss-green eyes finally reflecting something he hadn't felt in 30 years, a sense of total, unshakable peace. Years have passed since the twin disasters of ice and fire first tested the ridge. Oakhaven has been rebuilt, not as the fragile wooden town it once was, but as a community with a spine of steel. The silver arch of the Quonset cabin still catches the first light of every Montana dawn, but it is no longer alone. Dotted across the valley are dozens of similar structures, community centers, emergency shelters, and homes, all inspired by the madman who refused to let the world break him. At 60 years old, William Wynne's moss-green eyes have lost none of their intensity, though his salt and pepper hair has turned to a distinguished silver. He sits on his porch, the same one built from the debris of the old school, watching a new generation of K9S train in the valley below. Smoky, now a venerable elder of the ridge, lies at his side. The dog's muzzle is gray, and his pace is slowed, but his fierce loyalty remains an unshakable force. They are the living history of Oakhaven, a reminder that the best time to prepare for the storm is when the sky is clear, as the sun dips behind the granite peaks. William reaches down to rest his scarred hand on Smoky's head. He doesn't look back at his medals or his past secrets anymore. He looks forward. He sees a town that is ready. He sees children who know how to survive. He realizes that his greatest achievement wasn't building a bunker of iron, but building a culture of resilience. The Quonset cabin was never just a house. It was a testament to human spirit ability to endure, to adapt, and to protect. As the first star of the evening appears, William Wynne finally closes a heavy steel door, not to hide from the world, but to rest in a home that the world finally understands. The madman was never crazy. He was just the first one to see the storm coming.